Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CMI's 75th Anniversary Leading Lights Conversations. I'm Anne Franco, the Chief Executive of CMI, and in honor of our 75th anniversary, I'm speaking with a number of leaders across the UK on what really matters for management and leadership now, with a special focus on how to be inclusive. And today I am absolutely delighted to welcome Trevor Phillips, the founder of Webber Phillips, broadcaster, writer, and former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and a member of our 75th Anniversary Council. Welcome, Trevor. Lovely to see you.
Thank you, Anne. It's a privilege to be here with you.
Thank you. Well, let's get started. Now, do you think in this day and age that values, ethics, and culture should be at the heart of management? And if so, do you think they are at the heart of management? And if not, what could we do to get them there?
Well, I think that the answer to that is that, of course, they must be. And I'm sure that pretty much everybody listening would agree with that. The interesting thing is the why. And here's my why. Values, ethics, and culture determine purpose. And I think any experienced manager will tell you that one of possibly the biggest thing that we all stumble on often during our careers is the answer to the question, why are we here? I mean, what is the point of being a manager or indeed a leader at all? And the answer is that all organizations have to be driven by purpose. Now, we can argue about whether the purpose in any given organization is useful, whether it is correct, right, whether it is consistent with our own ethical code or not. But even if the simple purpose of an organization is to stay alive, it is still a purpose that guides decision making and guides the idea that we try to instill in the organization. So, and purpose is always inextricably linked to values and ethics and culture. Or I should say, what I would say is that most organizations' culture is an emanation of its values and its ethics and its purpose. Now, there's another word in that group that one might want to think about, which is behaviors. Because I think that the truth of the matter is that in the last 20 or 30 years, everybody's become rather, I won't say sophisticated, adept in finding words that are supposed to describe their values and their ethics and their culture. And you can read it in everybody's website, and you can probably read the slogan in the lobby when you enter the office. But I tend to think the thing that is most telling is behaviors. And what I look for is, when I turn up at the office, how am I greeted? Who greets me? What does the pyramid as I go from reception to boardroom look like? Because that tells me a great deal more about an organization's values and ethics and culture, and therefore its purpose, than what the CEO or chair spends half an hour trying to persuade me thereabout.
Couldn't agree more. It isn't about the words on the wall, it's how people behave. Absolutely, I think that's spot on. Now, if you think back, you've had a very distinguished and still are having a very distinguished career, but what are some of the challenges that you encountered when you started your career that you still think managers face today?
Choice, exercising choice, and you're kind to say that I still have a career. That's very kind, Anne.
Of course you do.
I think that the point of all leadership is very, very straightforward. It is always about choice, framing choice, pointing towards one choice or another, ultimately making that choice and saying to people, we're going left, right, up, down, and we're maybe taking a risk going left rather than right, up rather than down. But in the end, someone has to decide in an organization where it's going. And it seems to me that in various ways, that has always been the choice for leaders. Now, what is, I suppose it's slightly banal to say that management and leadership aren't the same thing, but, and I think that's sort of true, but I think it is less true than it used to be, particularly as we move towards organizations where talent and people and motivation are more important, because a lot of the operations are being done by machines and so on. And we are moving towards an economy and a society in which human capability and human capital are a greater part of an organization's assets than they ever used to be. Managing those assets does come down to the question of what we used to call leadership. And it seems to me the point of leadership is always has been, always will be a very simple one. Choice. And the choice is never between good and bad. I mean, if there were a choice for most organizations between good and bad, you wouldn't need leaders, because what kind of organization is going to survive if it's constantly choosing the bad over the good? If it's ever as clear as that, then you don't need managers, you don't need leaders. The trouble for most leaders is always that you're making choices between bad options, and quite often, most of the time, it's what is the least worst, or how can we make what looks like least worst feel like it's a good pathway to follow. Now, I think that if there's a new thing for leaders that is challenging, it is that in the old days when I started, I started in television as a very junior person. I was lucky. Television was then a sort of frontier industry, so you could rise very quickly. And so within 5 or 6 years, I was in the top 40 executives in my company. And I became head of a department, a division in ITV before I was 35. So I was very lucky. Well, there wasn't that much choice for the bosses at that time, but
I'm sure you're being modest there, but
I was very lucky that I rose quickly. But in those days, I think the difference was that big organizations were relatively opaque. People had to judge you purely by the product, what you put out, what you sold was the expression of who you were corporately. I think today things are very different in that organizations, both because of regulation, but also because of our culture, are more transparent. People can see inside the box. In the United States, they talk about the glass box corporation. So when an organization tells you we are ethical, or we treat our people well, in 1975 or 80, you kind of had to take their word for it. And if somebody said it wasn't like that, that the weight of the corporation would descend on them, and by and large, nobody would believe them. Whereas today, with the internet, with Glassdoor, with whistleblower legislation, actually the gap between what you say and what you are is made manifest very, very quickly. And I think that's a really new challenge for managers, to make what they say match what they do. And that's quite tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an excellent point, and it's much more difficult for people to say one thing and do another because it'll get called out very quickly, as you say. Um, but do you have a specific management challenge maybe that you've overcome um, um, by learning from the past? I mean, is anything in your past helping you to cope, for example, with this greater transparency? Could you give us an example?
Well, maybe I'll address a slightly different problem, which is what I think is probably the largest single problem that any leader has to deal with. And this is always a personal and individual problem, which has very little to do with the organization you're in, but is always true of any leader. And that is this. What do you do about problems which you know are soluble, but you are not the person to solve them? And when I think about drawing on the example of the past, on this particular thing, I go to the very, very distant past and think about the Roman generals who were granted a triumph after they had, crushed the Gauls or somebody somewhere else, and they're granted a triumph. They're able to bring their troops into Rome and drive up the Appian Way on their chariots. But the tradition was they always had somebody on the chariot saying to them, all is dust. That is to say, you are simply human, you are not yet a god. And what I draw from that is that the hardest thing that anybody in a leadership position ever has to address is the question, not of what to do, because you can work that out and experience tells you, and you can get people around you to tell you what to do. It is the test that comes when the truth is that somebody else could fulfill the task that's in front of you, but not you. And the reason it's not you is because you don't have the specific skill set, or, for example, you have historical baggage, or that you have built up, credibility deficit in some particular way. And I faced this quite a lot when I was at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, where there were many sort of ideological challenges and many pressure groups, and everybody wanted something different, and everybody thought they knew what was the right answer. And most of the time, it was navigable. But I do remember my deputy chair, who was a lady called Margaret Prosser, Baroness Prosser, sitting me down and saying on a particular thing, we wanted to reorganize the way the board worked. And I said, okay, we'll do it this way, and I will take on this particular role. And she then took me into my office and sat down and said, I think what you're doing is exactly right. That's exactly the right way to do this. But this particular role that you want to take on for yourself, you must not do, because nobody believes that you are capable of being neutral on this particular question. I know you are. I know you can do it. But the truth of the matter is, the fact that nobody believes, for various historical and other reasons, that you can do this means that from day one, you're going to be dead on it. And the outcome, the point I want to make out of that is that that was Margaret's job. And from the moment that she and I took up our roles, I said to her, your job is to tell me, number one, when I'm being an idiot, and number two, when I am not the person to do something that we think is important. And there was a specific deal between us that was her job, and I was not going to get affronted or angry or think this is a lack of confidence. And I have to say, that deal made enormous difference to the way I was able to do things, saved me on many occasions. So my advice on this particular question, learning from the past, is that the great thing that all successful leaders have is at least one person, and I would suggest almost probably more than one, who is given explicit permission to tell you, one, that you're an idiot, and two, that there are certain things that can be done, but not by you.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, and I know Margaret, and I'm sure she did that very well. So she was the person on your chariot telling you that you weren't yet a god.
Absolutely painful as all hell on some occasions, but exactly, I mean, brilliantly done.
That's a great story. Well, now, of course, we've mentioned transparency. We've mentioned actually, the gap between what you say you do and what you do is shrinking. And obviously, we're living in times of incredible change. So, and we've been talking about the past. So how do organizations find the right balance between embracing the past and learning from it and continuing it, and embracing the future and changing?
Well, I would come back to the first thing we discussed, and that is purpose. I think that sometimes organizations confuse custom with purpose, and the two are not the same. Sometimes, custom absolutely demonstrates your purpose, but you also have to make sure that the two things are not confused. Maybe an example of this is I was lucky enough to work for the John Lewis Partnership for some time. It is a great, wonderful organization, currently in possibly the most difficult business circumstances you could imagine. It will survive and thrive. I mean, I can say that almost as certainly as I can say anything, because its values and its ethics and its culture are profoundly, they are inscribed in the organization, in its thinking, in its behavior, and anybody who comes into it adopts those behaviors. And I think that's the reason it will always thrive, because it will find a way through. It's a mission-driven organization. Now, having said all of that, here's the problem sometimes, and here is a challenge that organization has faced, which, by the way, she might not thank me for saying this, but I think it's new leader, Sharon White, who is so annoying. She's a good friend. She's so annoyingly brilliant. She has never done anything, turned her hand to anything, and done it less than brilliantly. And I know she's going to do this one as well. I think it's a big challenge that faces her, which is that the strength of the John Lewis culture means that the people who join the partnership, to a large extent, are John Lewis type people. You have to some extent, buy into the partnership model. You have to buy into the mission, and to some extent, you have to be a character who feels comfortable with that mission. Question: does that interfere with the necessity to ensure diversity of thought and character and experience in that organization of what now 80,000 people? 100 years ago, when it became, or 90 whatever it is years ago when it became partnership, it wasn't so difficult, because the customers and the partners kind of looked and felt like each other. Now the customers are very, very different. They are very, very diverse. And our problem is, not our problem, the problem for the organization is that the values that are, and the behaviors and the kind of person that has made it successful is quite specific. And the question is always got to be asking itself is, does that specificity mean that our partners no longer reflect our customers? And that identity between the two has always been part of the success. So I think that's a kind of issue that, in a way, addresses the question you asked me. How do you manage those things? Well, the answer, in my view, is to stick to purpose, focus on purpose. And in the case of John Lewis, Sharon has made it very, very clear. The question that people in John Lewis always ask themselves: are we a partnership that does retail, or are we a retail business that happens to be a partnership? Which one of those two things is important? The interesting thing is, I think it's clear that Sharon has made the choice. We're a partnership, and we could be doing anything, but the key thing is our people, our values, what we offer to the customer, and we could be doing all sorts of other things, but what we are going to carry into the future is that partnership. Now, that's an act of leadership to make that choice. Personally, I think it's the right choice. Other people will have an argument, but the point is, she's made that choice. And I think that's the way that you manage the balance between the past and the future. You keep your purpose, and you carry the things that serve that purpose, that still serve that purpose, into the future. And the other stuff, you say goodbye to if necessary.
That's a really interesting example, and a great a challenge to answer that question, is looking at your purpose and keeping what matters. Now, one of the things that we're really exploring on the commission is the whole, you mentioned diversity, and in the John Lewis example, obviously we are still talking about getting more women into top positions, more Sharons, and getting more people from different ethnicities, right? Like Sharon, yourself, others, into leadership positions. So what do you think, as a leader, we need to do to speed up the progress on these issues, and how can managers do that in their own organizations?
For me, the fundamental rule here is treat this like any other business problem. I think there's a slight problem that's developed, and I'll hold my hand up to this. I may have been, in a way, part of the encouragement that developed this problem, to treat diversity and inclusion as though it's a sort of religious issue. It's a purely moral issue. And the reason that matters is that I think what happens quite often in organizations is that the board, the executive, the exco, and then everybody else tends to treat this issue, the set of issues which are to do with race or gender and so on, as a test of their own morality. Mm-hmm. Not a test of the organization, but they make decisions not by answering the question, what is right for our organization, but by saying, what will it make people think of me? And so typically, a great friend of mine, started as a colleague in television, who then went on to run the BBC and a lot of other organizations. Greg Dyke complained, as everybody now remembers, that the BBC was hideously white, and got all sorts of brickbats thrown at him. Anyway, the point is, Greg did, I think, quite a decent job in trying to get the corporation to do more. Now, whether the more was always right, we can argue about, but anyway, he got people focused on it. Almost as soon as he walked out of the door, all of that stopped. Nobody did anything, because it had become more a test of, were you on the right side of things? Were you a manager who was displaying that you cared and you were compassionate and you wanted, but there wasn't much attention paid to systematic analysis, to data, to the difference between attitude and actual behavior, which are things that we would ask about, for example, about learning and development. You know, we'd be crawling all over the data on that. But when it came to diversity and inclusion, the question was being asked, are you on the right side? Are you using the right language? And it was a sort of the language thing that has now become incredibly reified. You know, there's a priestly language about diversity and inclusion where if you put the comma in the wrong place in your email, you can look forward to the Inquisition. Now, this is just madness. I think we need to step back. We need to stop some of the flag waving, and we need to focus on what it is that we want organizations to do. And specifically, and I'll give you an example of in a way that why the thinking goes wrong here in a second, and start to apply the lens that we apply to every other problem. What do we know? What can we know? What do we want to change? What is most important on our agenda? Who has to act? How do we know they've acted? All those kinds of questions that we apply to everything else. And you know, saying we're going to put a new statement on our website, or we're going to send the CEO to speak to 18-year-olds in some particular quote unquote deprived part of the country doesn't cut it. You know, let's treat this like every other problem. So, for example, as you know, I chair a recruitment company, Green Park, and now klaxon alert for the advertisement. We place hundreds of people in senior positions. In the last year, more than 50% of those we placed were female. About a third were from ethnic minorities. Our biggest difficulty is always persuading the decision makers, the buyers, chairs, CEOs, and so on, to stop thinking about what will make them look good and think about how they will get the best talent. And that involves some analysis. It involves being honest about your own organization, and not thinking about what signal will a particular appointment send. Because if that's what you think about, you miss important things. So we dealt with a couple of organizations who have a specific problem. They hire quite a lot of people from African Caribbean backgrounds at the lowest, at entry level and so on. But these people, unlike some people from other ethnic minorities, tend to plateau and they leave at a particular place, round about in their late 30s, early 40s. What's going on? And the answer, generally speaking, to this in most corporations has been, well, I'll find somebody who's African Caribbean, I will groom them, and so on and so forth. We think, first of all, think about why you're losing the people who are there. And we have a hypothesis about this, which I think in the last year our work has demonstrated is pretty well founded. And it's this. Most advancement in most organizations is to do with the esteem in which you're held, what we call esteem. What do people think about you as a candidate for promotion? And that's made up of three things. One, their direct experience of you. Have they been on pitches with you? Have they sat on meetings with you? Are you on the same P&L as them, and so on? Secondly, the reputation of you. That is to say, what do people say about you? People who know you, people who observe your work. You might not have met they might have not met you, but they've heard X and Y about you. And the third is, what do people think about your category? That is to say, most of us, if we are completely honest, and most of us are not honest about this, when a woman walks through the door, we have already in our heads a judgment about her, because there's a category of woman about which we already have a narrative. Same about ethnic groups and so on. Now, that's not a crime. It's helpful if you're aware that that's what we're doing, but it's not a crime. What we've discovered is in large organizations, that third part of the esteem judgment is very large. And it's obvious why. In large organizations, you're unlikely to know the person you might have heard a bit more about them, but actually that big thing, that third bit is very large. And the category, understanding about Black people and men particularly, is very powerful. That is why you get this exit, and why those people, typically very talented Black people, go to smaller organizations. And we talk to them a lot, and what we discover, we publish a list of 100 top hires every year, and if you talk to those 100 people from minorities and you talk to the Black people particularly, they feel much more comfortable in a small organization because they feel judged on who they actually are as opposed to who people think they are. Now, the reason I lay that all out is that again and again we go into organizations and we discover nobody's even thought about trying to think that one through. So, and the reason it is because when it comes to diversity, they don't apply the same analytical lens that they do to everything else. Otherwise, this would be a rather obvious thing to think about. Happily, it's, commercially from our point of view, they don't think about it, so they hire us to think about it, which is great. But and at some point, it's going to be really annoying because people will work it out. But
yeah, now, well, it's interesting that you started by saying treat it like a business issue, and having written a book on gender balance, that's what I open with. Yes, of course, it's a moral issue, but you treat it like any other business issue. Diversity delivers better results, right? Better decisions. And you're right. In larger organizations, people do fall to judging people as categories rather than treating it as a business issue. There's a lot of virtue signaling. Now, you touched on language there, and I want to go back to that point of language. You said it's becoming, almost religious in how language, the importance of language. But yet, so many managers and leaders are absolutely, they're afraid to talk about issues of race or racism or issues of sexism or, sexual identity, because they don't know the language and they're just afraid of having the awkward conversation. So how do we build confidence in that area, and what advice would you give to them?
Okay, here comes trouble. This is the area in which well, you'll be familiar with this. Americans will say this is the third rail issue, isn't it? You touch it and you are electrified. I have two thoughts about this. One is a reflection on why this is the case, and the other is what we might do about it.
Mm-hmm.
The reflection on why this is the case is a straightforward one, I guess, from my experience, having been at the Commission for Age Equality, having been at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And it's this. Let us be frank, when it comes to talking about certain issues, in the corporate leadership space, the emotion that surrounds people is terror. And it's, and it's not a stupid emotion. I think it was in 2018, I can't remember who did this analysis, but it was demonstrated that more CEOs got fired for ethical transgressions than they did for failing to hit corporate targets. And the reason is because in the modern business world, particularly, reputation can have a dramatic impact on a company's fortunes. And the behaviors of leaders, we don't have to go to Harvey Weinstein to see this, but behaviors of leadership is dramatic, tells you a lot about the culture of an organization. And in a world where talent matters, where consumers have real choice, why would they choose you or your organization or your product or your service over somebody where their values, that organization's values line up more or align more successfully with the consumer or the client or the business partner. So this has become an incredibly important issue. And it, put it as simply, you get fired if you get it wrong. Here is the problem in some areas. It is in the nature of, this is why we argue about diversity. It's the nature of leadership in most businesses that they are led by white men, actually, disproportionately. And there's an interesting thing which we've just done some work at Green Park about the business, what we call the Business Leaders Index, and which has demonstrated a rather interesting thing, which is that historically the path to CEO has really been through finance, to some extent through divisional management. That's changing. It is now less finance, more IT, still divisional management, a bit more sales. What's interesting about that? Actually, as women have taken more positions in finance, it has become less of a pathway to the top. Now, that tells you a whole series of stories, but the fact that we still have a less diverse leadership than we would like, leads to a particular result. I think that the lines of human division for most people have started to come down. Most people at least can imagine themselves being older. They can imagine themselves being disabled. Disabled people are no longer locked away, and we can empathize to some extent. We all hope that we're going to get old, so we have some idea about that. We can internalize that. Almost everybody has somebody with whom they are intimate across the lines of sex, and even if it's your mother or your sister, or your brother or your father, you've got some intimacy. The places where it is quite difficult to cross the line are race, occasionally religion, and trans. And I think the reason that these two latter issues are so terrifying is that they lie behind an opaque curtain for most people. I cannot imagine what it is like to be white. I don't know. And I never will know, actually. I imagine that I will never really understand what it is like to be trans. And I think for most people, because these things lie behind an opaque curtain, they are terrifying. Add to that the fact that in the public sphere, coming back to the point I made about transparency, we hear more about things. There's social media and so on. Things are amplified much more than they used to be. And it adds up to a recipe for terror. Well, what do you do about it? Well, I think there are two things you can do about it. First of all, people have to be able to gain more confidence. Three things, actually. First of all, those who are, frankly, on the underrepresented side have to be more generous. We have to, I accept that sometimes people are going to get things wrong and say something about me, which I feel a bit uncomfortable about. But my answer to that is to tell them. Mm-hmm. Not to go to some newspaper and say he got my name wrong, or he thought I was Sir Trevor McDonald, or whatever it is. I'll tell them I'm not. I'm this bloke, right? So I think that there's an issue, first of all, about the speak up culture. And I think what leaders can do is make it more possible for people to be generous with each other. Secondly, I think that what you can do, in a way, is stress test yourself. And we have a process which we call a locked room, in which people can have very open conversations in which all language or no language is off the table, but you can have a discussion about it. So at least you're alert to something. Now, in some cases, you will be alert to the fact that certain language might be objected to, but you may still want to use that language. I, for example, will not stop using the terms men and women, not because I do not understand that there are people who have a different view about that, but because I have a different view. And the point I then have is that I'm completely open to a debate about that, but we can't be bullied into saying we believe something by omission or change of language in order to gain tranquility. And that, I think, is the third thing here. We have to be ready to have an open and generous debate. And there is, I think, an unhealthy tendency at the moment for people to retreat for a quiet life and for leadership in organizations to abdicate in these situations. A very important thing for boards, particularly, and for senior leadership to do. Whatever they want to say, I mean, a CEO may say he wants or she wants to put their pronouns on their emails, fine. But don't punish people because they don't.
Yeah.
Have the debate, but don't, we didn't go through all the fight for civil rights and for women's rights and so on in order to create a new repressive conformity.
Yeah, and be more generous and less divisive and more tolerant is really what you're saying. Yeah. And I think that's very well said, because oftentimes we're not, and that's not healthy, because as you say, people retreat or they're afraid to express their beliefs, and it actually exacerbates the problem, because people are treating each other badly. And that actually makes the problem worse.
And also one other thing I should say, and which because you've now lured me into being absolutely frank, which is always a dangerous position to be in. I think most organizations neglect an incredibly important thing, particularly for their younger and middle management, which is to help them gain resilience. Mm-hmm. The truth of the matter is, for example, if we think about race and racial slurs and all the rest of it. Racial slurs are never acceptable. They are never right. But let's be straight about this. Most people who look like me, by the time we've got into junior or middle management, we've had a lifetime of listening to people say things about us which are disobliging. And depending on our temperament or our character, we might front them up, or we might say, oh, let it wash over me, or whatever it is. But it's not a surprise to us. And by and large, we learn resilience. We learn how to manage this. Now, I think that what a lot of organizations are now doing is, first of all, frankly, treating people from minorities as though we're snowflakes. But actually, the reason they're doing it is because they want to feel better, not because they want to do anything for us. What they can do for us is give us an equal chance, an equal shot at being in the room where things happen and for getting promotion. Not being protected from something that we have experienced every day of our lives. So, get what is important right here. And secondly, I think, just get it in perspective. Amy Chua, who wrote the book about Tiger Moms, in her last book, Triple Package, said a really interesting thing. She said that one of her colleagues at, I think it's New York University, was in a way confronted by a student who was objected to the use of some mildly, not particularly offensive, but just mildly odd term. This person was Hispanic origin. And the lecturer, who was herself of Hispanic origin, said, yeah, I see your problem. But look, if somebody using this term knocks you out for a day or a week from your studies, how are you going to deal with it when they evict you from your apartment for being Hispanic? Honestly, let us focus. Let's make sure that we understand the order of hurt here. because there are things that people face which are way more serious than, what are now called microaggressions. I'm not endorsing microaggressions, to be absolutely clear. I'm not saying these things are okay, but do not focus on the smallest thing. Let me put it another way. I think a lot of organizations are focusing on these small things so that they can say they're doing something, so they don't have to do anything about the really big things.
Right,
So,
which is like promoting proportionately, right, and having more
exactly.
diverse leaders at the top. And I'm sure I'm sure that you're right about that. It's signing charters rather than creating diverse leadership teams. Or the whole
Yeah, you're
pronoun
absolutely on
debate.
the money there, Anne.
I think
Absolutely
there's some truth in that. But do you think that data will help? Because you said at Green Park you're collecting the data. Do you think that as we get more data, that as it becomes through technology and maybe through these more transparent cultures easier to collect the data, that the data will help us to make better decisions and do the right thing?
Yes, absolutely. And it helps in two ways. One is it tells us, I don't particularly like the word the truth, but it gives us something actionable. And to give you a sort of example, the Health Secretary has just done something, I think, commendable, in that he's set up a review into the use of oximeters, these things that you put on your finger to measure your oxygen flow. And for quite a long time, people who worry about health data and diversity have suspected that some kinds of medical procedures and instruments, not through anybody's intention, but just by their very nature, produce different results. And that the data on the use of oximeters and the treatment derived from oximeter readings has demonstrated that at least there's a question to be asked about this. And finally, Mr. Javid, who is a data geek, I know him quite well, he's a data geek himself, confronted with this, said, this is not we don't need to get into a big argument about people's intention or motivation or whether X is a racist or not. There's something which is not right here, and the data points us in the direction of what's not right. Let's work it out, solve it, because people are dying. And we don't have to get into a long argument about who's to blame. What we need to do is to work out why and what we do to fix it. Now, I think that is language, and this is my second point, I think that is language that any board or senior management feels more comfortable with. What they don't like, and what I think is more difficult and sometimes not really helpful, is a big argument about what's in people's heads. Because the truth of the matter is that almost nobody who is not a lunatic thinks that they're a racist. I mean, nobody thinks that they make judgments based on what I look like or what you look like. Most people think that they are being fair. And getting into an argument with them about what's in their heads, when frankly you don't know, is utterly pointless. What people can't argue with is the consequences of judgments that they may make or the environment that they've created. And that's what the data will show you. And I think most people find that conversation easier to have because it's not finger pointing. It doesn't absolve you of responsibility, but it doesn't start from the premise that you, because of what you look like, you happen to be white or you happen to be male. It doesn't start from the premise that that in and of itself means that you're at fault and you have to think differently. And also, by the way, the fact that you are supposed to think differently doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do differently, because I can point you to organizations led by women and organizations led by people of color who are just as biased in their behaviors and their outcomes as organizations led by white middle-aged men.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair point about the data, and it gets back to your earlier point, which I also agree with, which is these things should be treated as business issues and or problems to be solved, right? And the oximeter case that you mentioned is a very good one, because you don't need to have a moral argument. The oximeter's giving a wrong reading. Fix the oximeter, and more people's with dark skin will find that their lives are saved because they're getting the right treatment. Right, which is the point. Okay, just I wanted to touch briefly on COVID. What do you think? What's the biggest leadership learning coming out of COVID? Apart from actually that very important one about we need to fix the oximeters, but what else do you think has come out of COVID in leadership terms?
Well, I'll tell you what I think. For me, the great learning that comes out of COVID, or more precisely out of what we have had to do to cope with COVID, is that all the things that we thought were good practice aren't necessarily the best practice. I'll give you a very simple sort of recruitment outfit type example. We work with all sorts of organizations. I mean, Green Park is not particularly, we're not a diversity consultancy or anything, but I don't mind being honest about this. We spotted that there was a commercial gap, and we focused on it and got good at, we got better at it than other people. I won't say that we're brilliant at it, but we're, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man and all that. We got better than other people. So we have got to know more about it because we collect data and so on. One of the things that we discovered was that a lot of outfits who have always complained to us that it's quite difficult to get an ethnically diverse leadership because of where they are, have discovered that that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, I've worried about this for a long time. I started with the prison service, where a big gap has developed. There are a lot of minority prisoners in high security prisons. High security prisons tend to be in rural, non-urban areas where there aren't people from ethnic minorities. So the whole business of trying to get a staff that matches the prison population is very, very difficult, because no person from minority wants to move to a place where their child is the only one in the village, as it were. So I've been worried about this for a long time. What COVID has demonstrated, and we have a particular client for whom you should say it shouldn't have been, but it has come as a big revelation, that actually they have a lot of sites in the Northwest and a lot of sites in the Southwest away from big urban, because of nature of their business, they're outside cities. And they discovered that actually, because they're now moving to hybrid model, 3 days, 2 days, they don't have to ask all their senior people to uproot their family from Birmingham or Leicester or London. And that actually it worked perfectly well. People can be acclimatized to the culture, and in fact, in many ways, they work better in this way. So actually, it's upturned some of their recruitment assumptions. So I think the answer is that COVID has told us that many of the things that we thought were essential to successful business practices actually aren't any longer. And I'm not just thinking about remote working. I am thinking, for example, about the ease with which people have accepted new disciplines, social distancing, masks, and so on. Things that we always thought would be really difficult to do actually turned out not to be so difficult once people understood why they mattered. And I think that's probably going to be the big change, that we can do more than we thought, but we are going to be required as managers and leaders to be more explicit, more transparent, and more open with those that we work with about why we're doing what we're doing. And as long as we are, people will be more accepting, I think.
So that is a great place for us to come to the conclusion of, because you're getting back to where you started, because you started about the importance of behaviors and the rising transparency. And now what you're saying is COVID has actually made that even more important and helped us to learn why that is so important. So I think that's a great, that is actually a great point and a great lesson. Now, when it comes to your own vision, what do you think what does a better, fairer society look like to you? What would you like to see?
Oh, okay. That's it's a large question, and there's a sort of an anodyne, everybody has opportunity and all that sort of answer, but you know that already. What does it mean in concrete terms? Well, it's a very interesting question. I am a sort of, I consider myself mildly retired. That is to say, I don't actually work for anybody but myself in a way, and I work with the people I choose. When I left public office, I made myself a pledge, which is that I would never work in public office again. Secondly, I would never work except with people that I liked and whose values and purposes which I believed in. And I would say that the better, fairer society in my head, there are some simple tests, consistent with not being a sort of sharp-elbowed person who will trample over my neighbor. Do I get to be a person who can realize my talent and my ambitions? Am I acknowledging that there are some things I'm never going to be good at? I'm never going to be, as much as I would have loved to have been, a great athlete. I was always going to be a moderate athlete, but I could be a great something else. And will the society allow me to be that person, irrespective of what I look like, or where I come from, or who my parents were? That's number one for me, obviously because of my background. Secondly, is it a society in which we are all able to speak honestly to each other? We're invited to be civil, we're invited to be generous, but ultimately, are we able to speak our mind? And that is incredibly important for me, because in history, once you start to close down freedom of expression, you know who gets closed down in the end? Minorities. Majority will always have its voice, but freedom of expression is the last thing that gets taken away from oppressed people. The last thing that people take away is your voice. They can take your home, all sorts of other things, but if your voice is taken away, then it's all over. And the third thing about a fair and society, I suppose, and it's one reason why I live here rather than in other places like, France, or most of my family lives in the United States. I think a good society is one in which we keep things in perspective. We don't take ourselves too seriously. We don't take our hurts too seriously. We basically keep things in balance. And in this country, though, you know, we sometimes depart from that a bit. Generally speaking, the British tolerance of eccentricity and difference and sense of humour provides a sort of buffer by which we can deal with the frictions. And why is that important? I mean, the big thing for me, I always say that there are two huge things that matter in this century. One is how we live with the planet and how we live with each other. And we see that right across the world. The thing, I can't do anything about the first, that's not my territory, but the second, how we live with each other, I think does depend on a huge level of understanding of human frailty, a generosity towards our human clumsiness, openness to other people's, the fact that other people will see the world differently to the way that we see it. That to me is what's really important about our society. And I think we're very lucky in this country to have a lot of that. I think that there is a danger at the moment that we are abandoning that and trying to replace that sort of tolerance and generosity with some bureaucratic rules and cages and directives. I think that great leadership does that by example rather than by compulsion. And that I would be very, very sad to see that missing from our society, because I think we set an example for the rest of the world in that respect. And if we stop doing that thing, then I'm not sure where we're going to look for that kind of tolerance and ease and civility.
So that is, that's a great definition, very thought-provoking. All of this discussion has been incredibly thought-provoking and enlightening, and what a great place to end. And I think what you set out at the beginning fits in your definition of that society, which is, remember, just like those Roman generals, that you need somebody on your chariot telling you you're not a god. That's actually what you're getting at there. So great advice. Trevor, thank you so much for sharing these thoughts with us. It's been a great honor to have this discussion and get your views. And thank you very much. And to those of you who have joined us, if you've enjoyed this broadcast, please consider joining the CMI community. You'll find out how to do that in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.